Hello and welcome to this tutorial on creating a city builder, an isometric city builder in Construct 3. So initially here, this is the output of the game where you can see a grass field with a number of isometric tiles. Maybe it's hard to see, but they're really isometric. And the first few minutes of this demonstration or this tutorial, I will be showing you how the actual game works, what you can expect of what we're going to make in Construct 3. So let me start here by creating a road. And you see here the number of icons at the bottom. Whenever you click one, there is an icon, an extra bar here appearing with an extra set of options. And when you create a road, you can see that here we're creating a simple road, and you can see a preview of what we're going to create, the price, the upkeep, and some things are locked. Here a road with a sidewalk, for example, is still locked. You can see there is a padlock here and you can't use it. The same applies for the other ones here. This is a special one because this is considering zoning. So whenever we zone something, the application will automatically create some houses there for inhabitants to come and live there. This is for energy. You can see we can place a windmill, for example, for water, and then there's other services like police and stuff like that, but this is all locked. Education locked, leisure locked. You can build those, the things that are on your canvas, let's say it, or in the city itself. And then there's some management of the finances, which we'll come back to in a minute. So at the bottom left, you can see here that this is the time that progresses. Now we're currently running at standard time, which is about that fast. We can go run faster, even faster, or we can stop. We can pause the game a little bit. So here we see how that works. These are our funds, 10,000 in this case, and then there's the number of inhabitants. So let's start creating a road. And you can see when we start placing a road, the highlights here on the grass field where my mouse cursor goes, and here below we get what we call an Infobar. We'll see later how that is created and how that is maintained, but it's called an Infobar. And then we can start dragging like that. So this particular logic for creating roads is documented in a separate video. You can find it in my YouTube channel, and I will place a link in the description where you can find it. So it's actually also part of this tutorial. I won't actually explain it in this tutorial because I've already explained it in a separate video. You can just watch it, click the link in the description. But you see how it works in general. So the Infobar also shows this road, there's a road already present here, so the Infobar becomes red because essentially you can't place a road there. And then you see whenever we click, the roads will adapt themselves, and if we click with the right mouse button, we snap out of the road building. But we can delete off some roads. We can press the bulldozer and then we can say, okay, these roads, they need to go. Clicking right again will snap out of the bulldozer mode. So next thing what we can do is we can zone some things. So if we click on the zoning button, we have some residential zoning, commercial zoning, industrial zoning, and also an option to clear the zoning. So let's do some residential zoning like that. And you can see as time progresses, you can see that residential housing is going to be created next to those roads. And also we can't create something, we can't zone a section which is not adjacent to a road. So that those are checks that happen. And that way we can make sure that the city looks nice and clean. So you see here automatically the zoning appears. The houses appear here where the zoning needs to happen, and we see that, of course, we have some upkeep. You can see that here, so the number of the funds automatically reduce, of course, and also the people are coming into the houses. And if we go and click on a house, we can see here that this is residence 6009. It's got 5 inhabitants, but the capacity is only 10. And there's such a small capacity because it's missing some items. You can see here it's missing both electricity and it's missing water. So what we can do is we can go to the electricity menu and we can say, okay, I'm going to place a windmill. It's going to cost me 10,000 and it's an upkeep of 50. So we can click it there. And let's say this one does not need to be adjacent to a road. So you see what happens, but this place is already occupied, so we can't place it there. So let's place it somewhere over here, for example, and then we can click out of the menu, and then we'll see here there's an upkeep of 50. But the little fire and the bolts are not going away yet, and that's probably because we've already come to the maximum of one windmill is not enough. So we're only at 120 inhabitants here. So let's see. We'll see in a minute, for example, in the code how that is done, how these thresholds for how many inhabitants will be covered by a single windmill. But let's click one over here and let's place one over there. And you can see if you select a windmill here, that the windmill has an upkeep of 50, and what you see here, the bluish thing, is actually the range of the windmill. So we'll see in the middle in the budget panel that we can change the budget of electricity, for example, which would effectively decrease the area where the windmill strikes. So now we're still missing some water. Let's add a water tower somewhere within range, and then we can immediately see that the residences are now not missing anything anymore. You can click a residence and you can see here the capacity has risen to 30. That means gradually as the time progresses there will be more and more inhabitants coming to the city. Just a few seconds ago you saw that the city upgraded because we've reached a certain threshold. I don't remember what I set the threshold to, a pretty low number, so it could easily unlock the first level and easily get, for example, this fire station or police station. You put the police station somewhere like over there, and you can see also that there's a certain range for the police station, for example. So that's the way it works. We can also bulldoze some stuff. Let's bulldoze a police station. And we've already risen above a certain level again, so we're probably gonna have to put an extra windmill again. All right, and some extra water. So you can see that the settings of this thing still need to be tweaked. Everything you see here is done using settings, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. It's done using settings, and once we go and explore the settings and how the stuff works here, you'll immediately see how that works. If you press the escape button, we come to the game menu, and then we can save and load the game. We can quit the game or return to the game. Saving, if we save a name, we give it a name, for example, demo 1. We can save the game, but this demonstration of this save and also of the load dialog you'll be seeing is also documented in a separate video on my YouTube channel. Also for this I will leave a link in the description, and then you'll see how that works effectively. And then we press save, and now it's saved. We can pan and zoom using the mouse button. You can zoom in and zoom out using the scroll wheel, and if you want we can open up and then we can load a certain game. And if we click it, you can see here, okay, what the time of day when it was saved was that there were that many funds, that many inhabitants, and if you want to, you can load that game. I'm not going to do it, but it's there. The functionality is there. The last thing in the demonstration here I want to be showing you is the income panel. The finance panel, rather. You can click the finance panel and you can see here our income in residential taxing is 900. Roads is costing me 44, windmills are costing me 150, and water towers are costing me 200. So what we can do is we can increase or decrease the taxes this way, for example. And the budget, you can, for example, see that the budget for electricity is 100, but we can go and decrease that electricity budget. Let's decrease it somewhat to 60 or something, and it'll cost you less. But also what will happen is if we click some windmill, you'll see that the coverage of the windmill is less. So you have to take that into account when playing your game. So this demonstration, it's not a fully fledged city builder, so I'm not going to take into account some traffic or some the satisfaction of the inhabitants or something like that. No, it's just a template showing you how the principles work and how you can easily expand. So what's contained in this template is actually the essentials of a city builder. You can see building stuff, automatically zoning, building, having a budget, time progresses, stuff like that, and adding stuff to the city builder like satisfaction or whatever other buttons here at the bottom, and extra assets and extra visuals. It's all complementary, and it's not that easy, not that difficult, excuse me, to do, because all the essentials are there and it's well documented. So this is how the essence of the city builder, what it looks like. And now we'll get cracking and get into the effective code on how that usually works. So here we have the first thing I want to show you is we have it in the bar here at the project bar. We have a lot of different stuff going on, a few layouts, but there's actually not a single layout in this game. This is the game layout. And the other ones, if you go and click tiles, there are different tiles we're using here. You'll go and see that there are different road tiles. There is a base tile. We'll come back to that in a minute, what that really is. That is a grass tile. And then there's, that's it. Yeah. We've also got the build menu, which has a highlight and a zone, which are also special tiles we'll come back to in a few minutes. And then there's the assets layout, where we see all of the assets we can create. We also see these alerts. These are called alerts in the game. And you'll see that those assets, if you click an asset, it belongs to a family called assets, which is this one here. And these family assets, they give all of the individual assets actually some instance variables. Roadside requirements as an instance variable can be 1 or a 0. 1 meaning this needs to be adjacent to road. 0 means it does not need to be adjacent to road. Zoning. This is something that must be placed if we're going to build something automatically on the zoning, which is what happens actually. The zoning is auto built. We need to place on there some assets which belong to the residential zoning. Yeah. This game does not provide commercial zoning or industrial zoning yet, even though you can select it, or theoretically you can select it in the menu. It doesn't support that yet, but it's easily to expand. You just need to set it to a different color and then go and zone something in that specific zoning type, and then you have to have some assets which belong to that specific zoning type. So we'll have to make some factories for residential, for industrial rather, and you'll have to make some shopping zones for commercial, for example. But these ones all here are a little bit based on a theme. You can see that it's not too much of an asset, just changing some colors and stuff like that, but at least there are some zonings here. Then we see the number of inhabitants, which is now 0 because it's set at runtime, of course. Then these ones are not so important anymore, because we used to have some things like features and missing feature, but that's deprecated. So maybe for the final template I'll remove them. The asset type is important because everything has a different asset type. So these are residences. So residences, this checked in the code if it's a residence or not, because it does have some different behavior as opposed to other assets. And if you check the other assets, you can see fire station, police, power plant. You see everything is here has a different asset type. So the range, if you click the windmill here, you can see that the range is 7, and that's 7 in that direction, 7 in that direction, 7 in that direction, 7 in that direction. The asset name is empty because that's determined at runtime, but it's determined at runtime using the asset name template. You can see here windmill, and then there's some kind of placeholder %0, which is replaced with a number. The count of the windmill, for example, will be replaced by a 1 or a 2 or a 3. So the name will be windmill 1, windmill 2, etc. The capacity of the windmill is only 100, so this is definitely something that's going to need tweaking in an effective real-life game situation. But don't worry, it's just set to 100 to be testing the alerts and stuff like that. And then finally there's the budget reference, because the budget is determined not per asset, so there's no budget for windmills and there's no separate budget for example, power plants, but they do both have electricity as a budget, as depending budget. So instead of having to expand the budget checking for every single asset type, which will become cumbersome if you have more and more assets, of course, which is the general idea, we have categorized them under a budget reference. So these have both the same budget reference, and the water recycling here will have the same budget as the water tower. So basically that's how the assets work. So let's continue on, let's see. Let's start with some basic stuff. Let's start with the game here. And game is actually the, if we go and click here, game is the event sheet hanging on the main thing here. And let's start with, instead of starting with the game event sheet, let's start with the game layout, because there's some interesting stuff here. The interesting stuff is that this does not contain a lot of things except of some layout things, actually. So you can see here that there's an empty patch of space. There's no grass tiles here, you might have noticed. That's normal, because the grass tiles are created at runtime. So how that really works, I do refer you to the other video on creating the roads, because that's also where I explain how the grass tiles get created and destroyed. So I wouldn't be going into this in this video. Please refer to the other video, but you'll see that the effective grass tiles and what's on the game in the game when you're playing it is actually spawned at runtime. And for the rest, what you see here live is just some interface. It's actually just the dialogues and the menu and stuff like that. You'll see how that works. So if we go and check it out, let's start with the menu here at the bottom. So here at the left hand side, you can see that there's a time label, which will get updated every now and then, and every now and then the time is determined by these little buttons. And every little button, it's got a sign behavior, because as you've seen when we're playing the game, the button is going up and down a little bit, or it seems to be going up and down a little bit, and that's because there's a sign movement for the size, which goes making the button a little bit bigger every now and then. And it also has an effect, because only the highlighted button becomes blue and the non-highlighted button becomes black again. And this is done using an effect, and we just activate and deactivate that effect at runtime. So of course the indicators for the funds here and the indicator for the inhabitants, it's just two labels basically. And then there's the buttons. Let me zoom in a bit. The menu buttons. Basically, let's use this one. This is a button, build menu button, which has a certain function, which is checked in the game. So this has the function services. This has the function water and stuff like that. There's an indicator 1 or 0 to indicate if this is locked or not. If it's locked, you can click it, but nothing happens. And the menu is on. So this is the main menu, and everything as a sub menu has got a different menu indicator to check inside the code which button we're clicking. If we're clicking the main menu, then we need to pop something open. If we're not clicking the main menu, but the roads menu, for example, then when we're clicking a button, also we have to collapse the menu, for example. So that's what happens. And then inside there is an icon, and inside the icon there is a padlock, also with some stuff in here that we can use to identify the padlock. And it's at runtime, it's pinned, of course. We can see here that furthermore, the different menus are not created at runtime. They actually still already exist when the game starts, but they're not inside the layout. So what happens, as you'll see in a minute, the build menus actually get placed on this build new menu placeholder outside of the layout when the game starts. Whenever we click one of those buttons, such a placeholder gets moved to this placeholder, and then we can start some buttons, and whenever we have to hide that menu placeholder, it's moved outside the layout again over here. So that's what the menu placeholders, the bluish things here, are for. So there's an instance variable called on screen. This one is not on screen, and this one is on screen, so it moves between the two. And then we have some the info text bar here, so the text itself and the info bar, and you can see that the info bar has some effects. The effect is here set red. If there's an error indication, for example, it's set to red, and if there's just an informational text being displayed, it will become blue, and then it's the set blue effect that's going to play a role. All right. So then we have some extra dialogue and some extra panels here. What we see here, let me just hide the unlock dialog. What we see here is the assets panel, or the details panel for an asset. It's called an asset panel. It's on this specific layer, the asset panel layer. Excuse me, not doing very well, am I? This is the asset panel, which is the thing. If we click a certain asset, then there's a pop-up coming, and then there's this little asset which has a text which is an asset panel label with a type ID, and the instance variable ID is going to indicate what needs to be there, and then there's an upkeep and asset panel 1 description. And there's also, if we move that a bit, it's asset panel label with asset panel 1 as an ID. So at runtime, we're just going to check which asset panel labels has a certain ID and fill it in with the value we need to fill it in with. The alternative would have been that for every single label we had a separate object type, which would be very cumbersome, of course. So that's not the case here. And this here is, let me just lock that and click this one here, and this is the build menu details pane, from which we got two versions. Actually, the larger version, which we're clicking here, and this is the minor version, the smaller version, because as you've seen, when we hover over a certain asset, like for instance this police station here, then it's a little bit bigger because it needs to hold this preview visual, and then there's the upkeep and the price, which need to be indicated. But for zoning, for example, it needs to be a bit smaller, and then this is the one which will be displayed. So this is not an actual asset, it's a preview, and if we double click it, you can see that every asset here is an item frame in the preview. So this is not to confuse the game when we're counting, for example, the number of assets in the game, that this preview button does not count as an asset. By the way, what I didn't show you is if you go back to the assets and we double click here, then there's also 4 frames here with the orientation of the 4 residences here. And you'll see in the code that whenever something is built, the orientation will automatically change depending on how you, depending on the roads adjacent to what's being built. So they're nicely facing the roads every time. So this just as a side note, of course. And also as a side note, what we have here is the alerts, which have been grouped into the alerts family. And the alerts family actually gives us 2 things: a reference to the asset it should be hovering over, and an asset to the sign, and a behavior, a sign behavior rather, which is also moving the size and a sign behavior, so it gets bumping. Let's preview that, because this actually, so that's also something I needed to mention on the side here. So let's go back here, and I think I've basically explained everything here on the layout, because there's not too much things to explain, it's all interface stuff. What I do want to show you is that every dialog has its separate layer. You can see that here. I'm not going to explain the save and the load dialog. I do reference to the other video on my YouTube channel for that. Confirmation dialog is very simple: yes or no override. We'll see the code in a minute. The menu dialog is very simple as well. Finance dialog is something more interesting, because here we're also, let me just unlock that, and we're also seeing the detailed text coming up here, and it's always a detailed text, and that's also the ID which makes the difference here, and how we're going to pick the default text, which is the same thing for every default detailed text. And then there's the buttons, which also have a mode, and it's the mode that's going to tell us what the button actually does. So that's basically it for the visuals here. And now let's get cracking with the code. So here we are with the build menu event sheet, and in the build menu event sheet we've got some events for interaction here. Build menu functionality is some interaction inside the build menu. So when the cursor is hovering over the menu icon, the color should become blue. It's like an on-hover effect. And this is done using the set color effect here. It makes it blue. But it's only for zoning where the color indicates the type of the zoning. This should not happen. So if the menu icons menu differs from zoning, we just enable the effect. And also we reset the menu icons effect when the mouse isn't hovering, so then we disable the effect. So, and then we have some logic for when escape is pressed. What needs to happen depends on the state of the game. So first of all, the build menu should disappear, no questions asked. So the build menu, what if we were to click on the build menu, it will disappear. So I will click this open. So if the mode is none, that means that we're currently creating roads, making assets, or zoning. So the menu dialog should appear, allowing the user to save, load, and exit. So that's what we do, show menu dialog. So every function you can see here, we'll get to them whenever we stumble upon them in one of the other event sheets, of course. But if the mode is set to asset, that means that the placement of the asset should be cancelled. So the asset being dragged around is stored in the dragged asset variable by its unique ID, and so it's picked to destroy it. The highlights that might be present by dragging the asset around are also reset, and the mode is reset as well. So the asset is destroyed, reset highlights. When creating roads, also the highlights of the mode should be reset. And when zoning, the highlights and the mode should be reset, but also the zoning. That means that the highlighted zonings should not be shown anymore. So that's what happens here. When the left mouse button is released over the mouse button, that means that the button has been clicked. Everything that was highlighted and shown should be reset to facilitate the logic of the clicked menu. As new buttons get added to the build menu, the logic in this event sheet should be expanded, of course. When the mode is none, and that means that the build menu might be open when right-clicking. What should happen at that moment is just hiding the build menu, so with the right mouse button. When the mode is not none, something else what should happen when right-clicking. So the highlights and the info bar and the zone should be reset. Also the dragged assets should be destroyed. So when the cursor is over a build menu and the build menu is not main, whenever the mouse hovers a build menu which is not in the main menu, detail pop-up should appear with a preview of the asset that will create some extra details. There are two types of build menu with detail pop-ups, a larger one for assets and a smaller one for zoning. So there is a preview object type with a frame per asset that can be created. I showed you that one earlier. And the asset details JSON file contains the index of that preview animation frame, so it's obtained when showing the details pane. So let's go back here to the asset details JSON here, and you can see here this is an asset type, and this asset type has got a name, windmill. That's its price, that's its upkeep, and the preview is the index in the animation frame of the preview. We can set to show the preview of, in this case, a windmill, and that happens for every asset type currently in the game. Whenever you add asset types, just expand this JSON file to add this information as well. So that's what happens here. We set the opacity of the menu. So where we're not zoning is the smaller pane here, and this is not zoning, so this is the larger pane, where we'll set the opacity of the build menu details, which is the large one to 100 and the small one to 0. And then there's a separator in there in the preview, and the asset animation frame is set to asset details, which is the JSON file to get build menu dot preview. The function of the build menu is actually the asset type. You can see here this is the function of a zoning button. Well, whenever we would go to, for example, this one, you can see function is water tower, which is the asset type we just saw in the JSON file. So we set the value and the opacity for all of the labels we want to get. And the same thing happens here for the small detail menu, where we see here that the larger one is set to opacity 0 and the smaller one is set to opacity 100. So whenever the mouse is not over a button, the menu bit, the details menu should disappear, and then we hide the build menu details. So this is for the interaction in the build menu, not too much. And then we've got some functions. So here we have the Initialize build menu, which is a function which is called on start of layout. Actually, we'll get back to that in a minute. What needs to happen is it will initialize the build menu details by pinning the items to the background. So that cannot be done at design time, so we do it at runtime. So whenever we move the build menu details background here, everything, all the content will go along with it. So we pick all the build detail menu, the build menu placeholders when evaluating to 0, and then for each build menu, we pick all the build menu buttons attached to that build menu, and we also pick them to the build menu. And also the icons, we pin them to the build menu, and the log padlocks, we pick them, set them to the build menu. So that's what happens here is all of these things get attached to that thing. Basically, that's it. And all of these things get attached to that thing. So we can move this one and these ones here all around, so we can pin them together. So that's what happens here at this initialization step. Show build menu. We get a parameter passed along called menu. This function will show a certain build menu, one of the build menus I showed you. All build menus are already on the layout but hidden out of sight. When showing it, it's put in its place using an invisible sprite called the menu placeholder. There are two placeholders, one that's out of the screen and one that's on the screen and one that's off the screen. When a build menu is shown, it's moved to the placeholder on the screen. When it's hidden, it's moved to the placeholder off the screen. Basically, that's it. And also, we set the buttons, icons, and padlock opacity accordingly. That's what we need to do here. The hide menu, build menu, also gets a menu passed along with it. So this function will hide a certain build menu. All build menus are on the layout but hidden out of sight. So that's actually the same thing, but we will pick the build menu placeholder where it is not on screen, here 0, and then move it towards there, and then also set the opacities to 0. So that's actually the reverse function of show build menu. And then we have a helper function called her convenience function. Hide all build menus. It's actually just hiding all of the menus, so the roads, waters, energy, education, services, zoning. We also hide the info bar and the details. And then there's a function that also hides the build menu details, which sets all of the details and its contents to 0. Basically, that's it. For the info bar, there's also two functions. One that's called hide info bar, very simple. We will set the opacity of the bar itself and the text inside the bar to 0, and we'll also disable the effect set blue, set red. So the fact that the bar becomes blue or red indicates if there's an error or an informational dialog, or an informational info bar rather. So in order to have not too many effects currently running in the game, we will just disable the effect set red and set blue. So this function here, show info bar, shows the info bar by setting the contents to opacity 100 and disabling or enabling the effect to set the color to blue or red, depending on if we have passed along the info parameter or the error parameter. That's it. So the HUD is very simple. On every tick, we just update the funds label and the inhabitants label to a text here. But we use the funds and the inhabitants variables, global variables, but we surround it with a function called format string as number, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And then on button click of the pause, play, fast forward and fast forward, we set the time scale to 0, 1, 2, and 3. That's it. So that's for the build menu. So let me first show you quickly this helper function, which is format string as number. this is a small helper function I created to format a number with 1000 separator, because otherwise I don't like large numbers, those are not readable, and I like 1000 separators, but that's not a convenience function here in the construct itself to do that, to format the number. So what I'll do is do it itself. So whenever it's smaller than 0, then we set absolute number, return the value, and then we have a very complex let's say expression. If the length is larger than 6, means it's in the millions. We need to first take the first 3 parts and a dot, then the middle 3 parts and a dot, and then the last 3 parts and a dot. If it's larger than 3, else if larger than 3, then it's in the thousands, etc, etc. So that's what happens. And then if it's smaller than 0, we return a minus sign and that return value. Otherwise we do the same thing but without the minus sign. So basically that's it for the helper function. So let me then move on to the game event sheet, which is the event sheet linked to the actual layout. So here is what happens on start of layout actually. First we generate the base tiles because they serve as a placeholder for creation the other objects. So generate base tiles. If you want to see or know what this specific function does, again I will refer you to the other video also available on my YouTube channel, where I show you how to create the base tiles and create roads. So we read the road matrix JSON files to help determine which road pieces need to be spawned in each situation. The road matrix dictionary holds 16 keys as some kind of binary codes. For example, 0000, 1000, 1001. So the digits represent the side in order left, up, right, and down. That means that all zeros means that there's no roads on either side and of the evaluated road piece, and 4 ones means that the roads are surrounded by individual road pieces, so a junction needs to be spawned. So this is gotten from the JSON file, and then it's loaded into the road matrix. Then we generate the grass, and we hide the info bar, what we just saw, and then we get the asset details, which is a number of settings. I just showed you those asset details. So this is obtained here from the project. And then we load the style sheet, and the style sheet by file.css. I'll open it up here. Has just got some identifiers here for controls that are used to show the save dialog, for example, or the menu dialog. You saw that earlier in the video. They have some special layout and some special makeup, and this is what controls that. So if you want some extra information on how that works, there is a separate video also on my YouTube channel where you can either see how those save dialogues and load dialogues work, for example, or you could just also check out the video where I just load the myfile.css and see how to work with those CSS identifiers here. That's it. We just hide all of the dialogues, hide save dialog, load dialog, confirm dialogs. There are 6 possible dialogs here. They all have their own layer here, and showing and hiding and just shows the layer and hides the layer basically. We'll come back that in a few minutes. And then we're also checking if there are some save games. So check item save games, which will result in an on item exists, or optionally, when that item actually exists, we do load it from local storage, we wait, and then we save it in the save games dictionary. Well, that's what we do. Then we just disable the color effect of all of the menu items. We initialize the build menu, that's what I just showed you, that's pinning all of the stuff to the build menus actually, and we hide it actually. We do the same thing with the asset panel. We come back to the asset panel in a few minutes and we hide it. We initialize the auto build, we'll come back to that in a minute as well. And we just set the time scale to 1, which means it's normal timing. And we start the timer to go and counting all hours and minutes and days. So, and then we need some thresholds. The thresholds really, let me show what is in that JSON file. It's actually just a key value expression. So in order to go to level 2 of the game, level 2 of the city, we need 100 inhabitants. To go to level 3, we need 10,000 inhabitants. So I've deliberately kept this level pretty low, 100, to be able to quickly debug and check out the upgrade city upgrade logic. And then there's a second JSON file called unlocks, and then unlocks means that the services won't be unlocked in level 2 of the city. Education and leisure will be unlocked in level 3 of the city. Those are the unlocks files, and these two here, the level thresholds and the unlocks, are read here at start of the layout. So the settings is a separate dictionary. We could find it here under the data folder. It's actually a set. The settings are not loaded using a JSON file. They're loaded individually here. What we do here is we add a key called Texas Residential with value 5. Add key Texas Commercial, etc., etc. Those are settings which are actually set in the budgeting panel I showed you earlier. So there's 3 options for taxes. Well, it's those 3 settings that are being adapted. There's 5 settings for a budget. That's for those 5 settings being adapted. So why do we not load them from a JSON file? Actually, that's because this check here is in here, settings.keyCount. We will not read them from a JSON file, because whenever we do a load game, the key count will be larger than 0, and then these items will not be read anymore, will not be inserted into the settings dictionary again, and they will retain the values they had when saving the file, actually. So every tick we set frames per second and CPU just to keep track of the performance of the game here. So that's for the game. Event sheet. We've already had some event sheets here. Let's go to the interaction event speed. This is pretty straightforward. So we have something for panning. This is actually just basically the standard logic for panning you'll see in a lot of games, and also you'll see it in the code example of Syrah itself. So whenever the middle mouse button is down, we scroll to scroll X to minus X, minus pan X, etc. And we also incorporate layer scale, of course, because we can also zoom in and zoom out. We set the pan X, last X and last Y to the mouse XY. When we released, the panning is set to 0, so this is not called anymore. And the mouse button is clicked, we start the panning, and we set the initial last X and last Y, and we set panning to 1. So it's very simple panning logic we see everywhere. On mouse wheel down and mouse wheel up is just the zooming logic. We will set the layout scale to +0.1 and -0.1, but we will clamp them between 1 and 2, just not to be able to zoom in too close or too far. And then there's some highlighting logic. In highlighting, you can either highlight roads or you can highlight assets. When highlighting roads, we check if we're in the road mode. So the mode here is a global variable that holds a setting that denotes to the game logic what we're actually doing at that moment. It can be none, which is just the game being idle and doing some menu interaction, for example. But when it's set to roads, we're actually creating roads at that time. So the menus and everything that's going on here needs to take into account that at that time we're creating roads. And we can use that, for example, here when highlighting. We don't only need to do that on every tick when creating roads. And also not to do it too many times and to have less of a burden on the CPU, we only do that every 5 tick counts. So whenever the rest of division by 5 equals 0, so that means every 5 ticks we do this logic. So we reset all the highlights, and then we pick the highlight overlapping the mouse X and Y, and we enable the highlight. May set the opacity to 50 to have a little bit of a softer effect. So that means that whenever the mouse hovers over one of the tiles, the highlight is being set to a certain color and to a certain opacity. But if there is already something on if there is already a row there, and so if the pick of the overlapping highlight in X and Y has already a load in it and the mouse button is not down, then we show the info bar and the road is already present here. So if there is an asset overlapping that highlight, we also set an error, but this time we say this place is already occupied. So whenever there's no errors, we show the info bar placing roads. Double click to create a crossing. That's for the highlighting of roads. Whenever we are creating roads, whenever we're setting down an asset, where the mode is set to assets, and also every 5 ticks we do this logic. First we reset them, and then we pick the instance dragged asset. So whenever we start dragging an asset around, the UID is set into the dragged asset global variable, and so we can pick it here. And we can go and get the price for that specific asset. We can do that using the asset details JSON file here. But if the price exceeds the funds, then we have to show the info bar with an error and say insufficient funds, of course. If the funds are sufficient, we can start highlighting the highlights. We pick the one nearest to the mouse X and Y, and we set the highlight, and again we set the opacity, of course. Here again, if it is overlapping a road, we have to say this place is already occupied, or if it's overlapping an asset, and of course the asset is not the dragged asset itself. This place is already occupied as the error we need to give. And if there are no errors, finally, we just show the info bar and click to place the asset. And this is a little function to just reset all of the highlights. There's no picking going on, so that is applying to all of the highlights. Set opacity to 0 and disable the effects for highlight and error. So that's it for the interaction. So let's go to one of the more difficult event sheets here now. So this is the assets event sheet, which is controlling everything that is pertaining to an asset. So dragging of an asset, whenever an asset is dragged around, so we will do on every tick, if the mode is asset and there is a dragged asset being picked, we will pick that dragged asset and we pick the base tile nearest to the mouse X and Y. And what we'll do then, if the mode is set to asset, it means that the mouse cursor is dragging around an asset actually. So we pick it, and the orientation of the asset depends on the road placement. We call the set asset orientation function to change the orientation of the asset according to the adjacent roads. So what side of the asset is being shown, if we drag it around somewhere on a road, if the road is below the asset will turn the orientation to show, for example, the door and the windows close to the also to the downside. If it's a road is to the right, we will change the orientation of the asset to show the doors and the windows, for example, to that orientation. So that's what happens here. Set asset orientation, which is a helper function we'll get back to in a minute. So for asset placement, we have it already here. Set asset orientation. The set asset orientation. Basically, a function will change the orientation of the asset according to the adjacent roads. So by picking the asset was passed as a parameter and retaining its X and Y coordinates. That's what we do here. And then we have 4 indicators indicating if the road down, up, left, or right of the asset. And we use that using the get road down, get road up, and get road left, and get road right. So again, I will refer to you to another video on my YouTube channel on how to create those roads, and you will see that there is some helper functions there to indicate if there is a road down, up, left, or right, starting from X and Y coordinate here. So we pick an instance or the UID with road down. So this does not return 1 or 0, it returns a UID. So potentially there are 4 UIDs in each of these variables. And the road down differs from 0. We will read and we see that the road, the road's object type here, what we picked here, is a road and down, road and up, road and horizontal. We will set the animation frame of the asset to horizontal down. And we do that for every possibility here. So remember, every asset has 4 animation frames, one for showing him left, right, up and down. This is just selecting the correct animation frame, depending if there is a road up, left, right, or down. And if we can find anything, so if there is no road adjacent, we just set the animation frame to horizontal down, basically. That's default. So when the leftmost button is clicked and the mode is in assets, what we'll do is we will pick the dragged asset. So when this is clicked, when the leftmost button is being clicked, in this case the asset is actually just being placed. Which asset is being placed is in the dragged asset. So we pick the asset and obtain the price of the asset based on the asset JSON file here, based on the asset type. And then if there are enough funds, we will set the mode to none, and we set the dragged asset to 0, we set all the highlights, we hide the info bar, and we subtract the price from the funds. So next, all of the assets of type residence have to be picked and assessed. As the capacity of the residence fluctuate by the number of assets surrounding it, for example energy and water, the capacity needs to be checked if there is an asset placed. So then we go and pick everything of type residence, and we will call the function assess asset assess capacity, which we'll come back to in a minute. So also there's a very important event here. We just check it all of the time when the modes equals assets. And we'll call the set asset z index, and the asset z index setting is a very simple yet a very effective one. We just, for each asset, every asset on the layout, actually we pick it and we loop through it in y by the y coordinate but ascending. By doing that, and each time for each loop moving that to the top of the layer, they are isometrically correct, meaning that everything which is closer to the camera will appear above everything which is further from the camera. So that's a very essential part of the isometric logic here. So when the asset is created, the number is automatically set. This is done by using the name template of the instance variable. In the name template of the instance variable, there's a %0 placeholder here, and then the 0 is replaced with the count of that number of assets. We get that count using a function called get number of assets by type, which will result the number of assets for that given type. Right. So the asset range. Asset range is whenever you click an asset, if you remember, there is a circle, it's actually a square surrounding the asset, which denotes what is the range of that asset. And asset highlight range, what it will do in this function will highlight the range of an asset by first getting the range of that asset. Getting the range of an asset will fill the range dictionary with UIDs of all of the base tiles in the range of the asset. So that's what we do here, we call that. And then for each entry in that range dictionary, we pick the base tile attached to it. So the range contains UIDs of base tiles. So we pick that base tile, and then we pick the highlight overlapping that base tile, and we set the set highlight effect of the highlight at 50% opacity. So this function here, asset get range, is actually this second function. And this is a pretty big one because there's some logic involved here. What we do is the function will get the range of an asset by determining all of the base tiles that are in the assets range and adding the UIDs to the range dictionary. So if we just clear it, of course, here, And then we pick the asset we've been passed along as a parameter. But the range of the asset depends on the budget of that asset, actually. So if we're checking the range of a windmill, for example, it depends on the energy budget. And every asset has got an attribute called the budget reference. So we get the budget from the settings here, settings.get budget reference, which is a setting of 0 to 1, which is let's call it a factor. If it's set to 1, the full budget applies. If it's set to less than 1, 0.5 for example, only the half of the budget applies. But the budget can also be set to 200, for example. So what we do is, if the budget reference is quote quote, then we just pick the range of the asset, but if it is, we just get that factor of 0 to 1 and we multiply it with the range. As we take the floor of that, this is now the budgeted range. So and then we do a range loop for 1 to the budgeted range. So we start looping through the base tiles to the left and to the right of the asset by picking the overlapping blue base tiles at an x and y coordinate relative to the loop index. So we use 45 and 26 offsets due to the isometric layout. That's what we do here. Loop index times 45 plus the y loop plus loop index plus 26. So we loop through all of those base tiles to the left and to the right. For each of the base tiles, if it's not already in the range, we just add it to the range. So we do that to the right, we do that to the left. And the only difference here is the way it loops. So here we see assets.y plus loop index times 26, assets.y minus loop index dot range times 26. So next we start from the items that have just been added to the list. We start for range for each key, which has been added here, and we put everything in the list that is up and down from that coordinate to fill the space. So we do that and we do exactly the same thing, but now we go up and we go down. But instead of adding them to the range immediately, we just add them to a temporary file. Not a temporary file, to a temporary dictionary, of course. So and then what we do here is so what's left is only the assets directly up and down from the asset. So we pick up from the asset or we pick down from the asset, and then finally we put everything that was in the loop dictionary in the loop dictionary, in the temp dictionary, in the range dictionary itself, of course. So that's how that happens. So this is a little helper function. Asset is in range of a certain asset type. So this function will check if a certain asset is in range of another asset within a certain asset type. So both as passed as a parameter. So we pick the asset that's passed as a parameter, and we pick the base tile which is attached to it. And we pick first the asset passed as a parameter and retain the base tile UID that is based on the x and y coordinates. We pick the asset by evaluating that asset type, so that can be multiple. And for each of those assets, we loop through them and we get the range. And if the range holds the base tile UID we picked earlier, that means that value is in range. So actually what this is going to do, if we pass it an asset, which is for example a residence, and we pass it the asset type energy, it will turn a 1 or a 0, a 1 if that asset type is in range of some energy, and a 0 if it is not. So that way we can determine if a residence has energy or water and stuff like that. And then there's another function called asset get missing feature, which will actually result in a string, which by default equals none. But if a certain asset doesn't have a windmill or a power plant, we say it should return energy. And if it does not have water recycling or a water tower, it should return water, because at that time it will be missing energy and water. And notice we use the asset is in range of asset type, which I just explained, to return these indicators. So asset interaction. When interacting with an asset, there are two possibilities. So either it's being clicked and the details should be shown, or it is being bulldozed. There's only two references. So if the mode is bulldozed, in this case, the asset should be removed. And if we're removing a residence, also the inhabitants should change. It should decrease the number of inhabitants with the asset's inhabitants. And then finally destroy it. If the mode is set to none, then we're just highlighting the asset. What we do is we reset the highlights and retain the highlight asset as a variable and retain the range of that asset. And we show the asset panel here. And when clicking the right menu mouse button, the asset panel with the details should disappear and the highlights should go away as well. So that's what we do here. If the right click mode button is clicked and the highlighted asset variable, which is set here in this action, it will disable this by setting it to 0 and resetting the highlights and hiding the asset panel. So that's for the interaction. So there's one last helper function here, get number asset of asset type. Remember, this is used when setting the name of a certain asset when an asset is created. What we do here, we get an asset type passed along, and then we pick all of the assets of that certain asset type, and then we result the value is just the picked count, actually, just that. What we have here is the asset assess capacity. So this function will assess the total capacity of an asset, specifically if it is a residence. The capacity stands for the number of inhabitants as a residence can hold. Standard are only 10, but as the number of features increase, so does the capacity, and the automated monitoring, which we'll come back to in a minute, can add more inhabitants to the residence as needed. So what we see here, we assess the capacity. So we start at 10, and then we use the asset as in range of asset type to determine if it's eligible for extra capacity or not. So you could feel free to add more depth into this logic or extend into new asset type, of course. So if it's in range of a mineral or power plant, we add into the capacity. If it's in range of a water tower or water recycling, add in, etc., etc. And then we get the total capacity. So the total capacity of an asset type group. So specifically not an asset type, because we don't want the total capacity of windmills. We want the total capacity of the combined value of windmills and power plants, because that's the capacity of energy. So this is going to be used when assessing if a city has enough energy or not, and if you want to have extra windmills in the city to provide all the energy for all the inhabitants, for example. So that's what it says here, to get the total capacity of a certain asset group. And what we do here, if the asset group is energy, then we pick all the assets, which is a windmill or a power plant, and then we add the asset's capacity to that total capacity, which is a local variable here, and finally we return that local variable. So that's a lot of functions here in that assets event sheet, but I think we've got the most difficult part is behind us. So the asset panel here is just the little panel showing the details of an asset, but the details of an asset is not too far fetched here. Of course, we initialize it. That's being called on start of layout. We also pin the labels and the separator to the asset panel, actually just like we did with, for example, the build menu. Hiding the asset panel is just setting the opacity to 0, and showing it is setting the opacity to 100. And also we set the position to the X value of the asset itself plus 50, so we can just gently see the asset we've clicked, and next to it is the asset panel, and then the Y coordinate of that asset panel. So there's a number of different asset panel labels, but they all have a different ID. So we pick them one by one and we set the contents where we need it. So the logic is further different for residences versus the other assets. So feel free to further expand this function to show me details of an asset, whatever you want. So now we get to the auto build functionality, and the auto build functionality is actually whenever you create zonings of a residential, commercial, industrial, for example, this function will automatically build residences of those different types on the zonings you've indicated in the game. So we initialize the auto building by creating a probability table for the different zone types and the different types of assets that can appear in that zone. So right now there's only residential, but feel free to add commercial, industrial, etc., or even more segregate into low or medium high density, whatever you want to do. There's only 6 different houses to find in the game, of course. We can extend where needed, and if some asset types are more rare, or we can tweak the weights in the advanced random table here. Now we've all set them to the same weight. So this is the function that actually will build the random auto builds. So we've get passed along a zoning, and this function will perform an auto build of that certain zoning. So this is called in the timing functionality. So we set the current probability table to auto build for that specific zone. This is already taking into account that at some time you will probably add some advanced random probability tables for other zonings as well. So we pick a random instance of a zone with that zoning type. So we first pick them all, and then we pick a random instance, and immediately set the zone instance to none, so it's dezoned immediately. And then we pick an asset type, because these are the object types of the different zonings of the different houses in the zoning, and we create an object with that advanced random.weighted, and we do that on the assets layer at the x and y coordinate of the zone we're just replacing here. So we pick that last created asset, and we stop the animation, because the asset, of course, has 4 animation frames for each orientation. We stop that animation, and we set the correct orientation immediately using the set asset orientation function, which we saw earlier. Then we wait for the next cycle of the window loop, and we set the Z index correctly. We set the asset type to residence here, and we immediately assess the capacity of the newly created asset. And then we create alerts linked to that asset, but hide them immediately. Whenever an asset is missing some surrounding assets, the alerts will appear due to automatic monitoring. So the alerts are the little lightning bolt and the little water drop here. We just create them, move them to the top of the layer, attach them to the asset, and set the opacity to 0. And we also disable the sign behavior, so it's not going up and down anymore. So just creating that specific alert here. So then we get to the monitoring part. The monitoring part will monitor a lot of things here. We will get monitoring the inhabitants. So every 5 seconds we check all of the residents, and we get all of the inhabitants of the assets, and we add them to the inhabitants global variable. It's the same for the upkeep. We every 5 seconds we reset a local variable, the global variable rather, to 0. And there's also an expense details dictionary. So for the upkeep, we pick all the roads, and we say, okay, pick count dot times the asset details, the upkeep of a simple road. We add that to the upkeep, and we also add a line to the expense details. So this expense details dictionary is used in the dialogue, in the finance dialogue, to show the details, the wrap up of the details of what's being cost, what are the costs of the city actually. So it's not only setting the upkeep, but it's also immediately updating this dictionary as well. So then we go to everything which is not a residence, of course, because residence doesn't cost me anything. In contrary, they provide taxes. So for every asset which is not a residence, we will get the upkeep of that residence, but we will multiply it with the budget reference, of course. So if we decrease the budget, then the upkeep will be less. But if you increase the budget to 200%, then the upkeep will be double, of course. So if the expense details dictionary has the key asset type, we will set the key to that asset type and the amount of upkeep it will take us. If it doesn't, we will add the key. So actually basically the same thing happens here for taxes, but the taxes is done using the asset type residences, of course, and then we will add it to the income details rather than to the details of the expenses. So it's to do here to add taxes for commercial and industrial. It's not done here, but feel free to do that. And then there's some monitoring of alerts. We don't do that every 5 seconds, but every 8 seconds, just to lessen the burden on the CPU. We just initialize them first, and then we loop through the residences and we check if it's got a missing feature or not. We can do that here using that function we discussed earlier, asset get missing feature. If the missing feature is energy, we just show the energy alert. If it's missing water, we just show the water alert. Also, we have to show that if the total capacity of energy or water is not enough. So we show the alerts for all other assets, and here we use that asset get total capacity, which I showed you earlier, to get the full capacity of energy. And if it's smaller than the inhabitants, the inhabitants is larger than the total capacity of that energy, we should show also that alert for energy or for water, of course. So we also should regularly check if the level of the city is being increased or not. So every 3 seconds we will get the new threshold of the level +1. So how many inhabitants should I have to reach that next level threshold? And if it's bigger, then we increase the level. So the next time this will be a higher number, of course, you will have a threshold. So we'll loop through all of the unlocks for that level, and we just unlock the menu button here. We set it to 0, and we also hide the padlock to show that this is now available. And we show the unlock dialog, which will tell you, okay, congratulations, you have just unlocked a new asset type. So roads and surface setup, I'm not going to expand on that one here because there is a separate video on my YouTube channel how to see how that works, roads and surface setup. So please check out that video. There's the time functionality, and the set time scale functionality will set the time scale of the system here to a certain scale passed as a parameter. And then what this logic here does is we just disable the sign and the color of the little time button at the left bottom, and then we just enable again the ones for the scale. For example, if we set the scale to 1, then the play buttons sign will be enabled and an effect will be enabled, and all of the rest will say disabled because we disabled them for the time buttons here. We start the time timer, and every time the time loops, so every 0.2 seconds here, every time that fires, we add 5 to the current minute. If the current minute equals 60, we reset it and we add 1 to the current hour. If the current hour is 24, we reset it and we add 1 to the current day. And then we call the on the hour and the on the day functions here and here to denote what needs to happen every hour and every day. Of course, we set the time and the day here in the update HUD. And so on the hour, what needs to happen? We need to call the auto build random for residential, but only once every 3 times. So if the floor of random 3 equals 0, that means once every 3 times, for example. So it's not done every single hour. So the advanced random build functionality won't be called that fast, and the city won't grow that fast. So we can tweak that, of course. And also 1 and 2 chance we will see what the capacity of the residences are. So regularly check out the capacity of the residences and increase the number of inhabitants if possible. So the number of inhabitants as an instance variable, and capacity as an instance variable. The capacity is increased gradually as there are assets surrounding it. So for energy we get a higher capacity. If we add water we get even higher capacity, and that's what we check here. If the inhabitants is smaller than the capacity, for example there are only 23 inhabitants but you can go up to 30, we just add one, and we do that until it reaches full capacity. And on the day we should subtract the upkeep from the funds and the taxes from the funds, and these individual global variables, upkeep and taxes, are then defined here in the monitoring we just saw. So because there are a lot of variables, I had a separate instance and a separate event sheet rather for all of the variables here. And this one, the zoning here, highlight zones, will show function will show the highlights of the zone in different colors depending on the zone type. Right now we only have residential, but there's also support here for in the commercial or industrial. For example, there are 3 different color effects. One's called set residential, set commercial, and set industrial, which will give the zone a different color depending on what zone type it is. So read set zoning will pick all of the zones that are on screen and in that zoning. What we will do is disable these effects, so that if is zoning allowed will return a string actually for a certain zone, and the string will either be space occupied, no zoning allowed, space occupied, no zoning allowed, or it must be adjacent to a road. So what we will do is we pick the roads overlapping the zone X and Y, and if there is a road there, that means that space is occupied, and we return that error string. Same thing here, no zoning allowed when overlapping an asset, and then we check if the road in the road matrix key, if it's surrounding a tile. If it's not allowed. So if the road matrix key is 4 times 0, then the zone must be adjacent to a road somehow. So that we go to every tick, and each 5 ticks, and we are zoning, we will reset the zoning highlights, and then we highlight the zone by picking both the zone to check and the highlight to check over the mouse button here. We set the zone opacity to 50, we get the total, the message here, zone is zoning allowed, which will return the error message here. And if there is no error message, zoning is allowed, the Infobar is shown and the correct color effect is enabled. Show Infobar zoning area, and that commercial, for example, for info. We set the correct color, of course, and when there is an error message filled in, the only thing what we'll do is show the Infobar with type of error and that error message. So if the mode is zoning, the current zoning is none, then we're actually clearing the zoning. And so we just show the Infobar, click the zone to clear it. And then on left mouse button, of course, when we are zoning and the zoning is allowed, then we set the zone of that current zone tile here to the current zoning. So that's it for the zoning. I think we've had all of the event sheets now, except for the different dialogues. So in the confirmation dialog, mostly all of the dialogues here have the hide and the show function. So the hide function, generally what it does is just it hides the confirm dialog, it deactivates the logic, and it activates the main logic of the game. So the build functionality and the asset interaction, those are the main functionalities where the click events, etc. happen. These are activated when the hide of the dialog, and on show of the dialog, these are deactivated, but the logic of the dialog itself is activated, and we show the dialog by showing the layer. And also the mode becomes none, so the game is idle then when hiding a dialog, and the mode becomes dialog whenever we are showing a dialog. So every single dialog does something else when the buttons are clicked. For this confirmation dialog, if we click yes, then we need to add the text input to the save games and save the save games here. I will revert you to another video on my YouTube channel where I show you how to use such a load dialog, save dialog, and confirmation dialog. So I won't go over the details of the logic here with them. Please check that other video for the save and load dialog in my YouTube channel. The finance dialog, on the other hand, also has the show and hide dialog or functionality, but here we do some extra stuff. So the dialog consists out of a number of detailed text objects, each with a different ID. So we initialize the text when showing the dialog. The income details dictionary contains the details of all income for the players. We just saw that in the monitoring. If it's empty, there's no income yet. But if it is, then we loop through every key and then we append it here to that detailed text. Same thing happens for expenses, but then with the expense details dictionary, of course. And then in the section below, we get all the taxes and budgets from the sections dictionary, from the settings dictionary rather, and show the current value. Budget is stored as a percentage between 0 and 1, so we multiply it by 100. So in the logic of the finance dialog, there are other buttons here. We have the buttons on button click when the mode is tax residential plus, meaning that we're clicking the plus button on the taxes of the residential. So what we do is we set the key taxes residential plus 1 and we update the text, etc. So this happens for every taxes button, the plus and minus combinations. And here exactly the same thing for the budget electricity, but instead we use the budget electricity. Here we do minus 100 times 100 minus 1 divided by 100, so to keep track. So the plus and the minus is done in units, but it's stored as a factor of 0 to 1, so that's what we're taking into account here basically. So load and save dialog, I refer you to the other video on my YouTube channel. And menu is very simple. We just on exit we use the browser close. On return we hide the menu dialog. Save shows the save dialog, and load shows the load dialog. And finally there's a little dialog that shows congratulations, you've unlocked the next level of your city, and it also just has a button with the mode close, and we just hide the unlock dialog basically. So that's it. I think I've explained everything to you now on how this city builder works. I know it's a big thing to grasp, but you can watch this video as many times as you like, of course. I hope you liked the video, and as always, please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I will leave a link in the description of the video to the Sierra store, where you can get the template for this for everything I've just shown you. So see you next time.